Hello, this is Michael Hexter. Welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So, this episode I'm calling In Ukraine Gyrations, Left is Still Overlooking / Undervaluing Its Own Basis in Democracy and Self Determination. Well, in this title, I'm trying to express what I feel to be a way in which the left has been unsure how to categorize what's going on in Ukraine and also what the attitude of countries, and particularly the left in the United States, but also in other, you know, developed countries or highly developed countries in the metropolitan center, let's say NATO members, most of them, what their attitude should be with regard to the war in Ukraine, the issue of military aid to Ukraine, and also the issue of negotiations and what stance one should have with regard to urging negotiations upon the Ukrainians and also upon the Russians, but for fear of of nuclear war. Okay, and it appears to me that parts of the left, some of which I have some respect for, like for instance on the Majority Report, Matt Lech, and it was very smart, and Sam Cedar, and others. Also, I've seen, for instance, DSA chapters in the International Committee of DSA um, tend toward a set anti-U.S. imperialism and pro-Russian, or at least agnostic to Russian imperialism and aggression in that area of the world, and so, or trying to acknowledge, let's say, in some versions now, when it's become very obvious that Russia is committing war crimes and targeting civilians, so forth and so on, that they acknowledge this, but then nevertheless return to a position, a comfort zone, where negotiations and, let's say, a 1990 / 2000 style pacifism and detente, and the attempt to create detente with other nuclear powers predominates over a recognition of a form of imperial aggression that doesn't originate in the United States, but originates elsewhere, in this case in Russia. So, sorry, it's a long sentence, but there's a lot of different thoughts in there and a lot of different. I'm trying to sweep together a number of different groups and actions. Different DSA on the one hand, slightly different. The Majority Report, I very respected, and I respect also a left podcast / videocast YouTube channel. So anyway, it seems to me that that they're trying to fit Ukraine into a box that is a trusted and standard box from the era, as I'm saying, the post-Vietnam era, or the post-World War II / post-Vietnam era, where the United States was the unchallenged hegemon in the world, and what is a progressive or left or anti-imperialist position would be to locate oneself always either in one of two positions: one, supporting a people that are struggling militarily against a U.S. puppet regime or against the U.S. directly, in a most often a developing country, but also even in Western Europe, anti-NATO, NATO being thought to be a cover for and a substitute for U.S. domination of Western Europe and Europe in general. And so, um, the combination stance is one, supporting these movements of anti-U.S. domination, and two, um, supporting detente in the United States vis-a-vis Russia and other nuclear powers. So negotiations with them to attempt to A, avoid nuclear war, B, attempt a nuclear disarmament. So all of these they're not bad ideas, okay? They're not fundamentally wrong ideas, and they have their place the uh, in the instrumentarium, you could say, in the political cabinet of potential, positions which the left can choose from. But in addition, when we're faced with a different kind of imperialism, but still an imperialism that does not fundamentally or does not originate primarily in the United States or is not driven by U.S. Interests, at least not remotely by U.S. interests, though maybe triggered by them. So I'm not saying the U.S. has no role in the Russian expansionism, current expansionism, and imperialism, in terms of triggering it, in terms of various negotiations that have failed, and so forth and so on, or overly aggressive postures vis-a-vis Russia. Nevertheless, though, that kind of imperialism has there's a different actor involved, or a set of actors involved in a different style of imperialism also, and I'll talk about that in a subsequent video. But anyway, style is maybe a superficial way of saying a different type of imperialism. And so than the U.S. form of imperialism, or the U.S. Western, let's say, you can say NATO, but I would say U.S. primarily form of imperialism. So, but anyway, so this comfortable place for the left has been disturbed by the Ukrainian war, the war against Ukraine, and then the fight back of Ukraine against that, and the obvious heroics of and positive ideals too, that which the Ukrainian government has represented in their fight back. They've been representing democracy and self-determination, and also European insulation from autocratic blackmail and control, also via fossil fuels control from Russia. Okay, and to some degree also there are other ways in which they could be manipulated, not necessarily only Russia, but in any case Europe, the European democracies, such as they are in different forms, but nevertheless relatively strong forms of democracy, at least for their own populations and so forth and so on, that they are also, they have interests, and they're actually, some of the ideals of the American left involve actually pointing the sort of social democratic left, and even slightly further left to that, involve pointing to Europe and saying, hey, look, why do we do things in the United States so poorly, so savagely, you can say, so barbarically, so cruelly, maybe is a better word, in terms of treating our own people, rather than having more of a social democratic social contract, and in not throwing individuals out into the marketplace, and basically allowing them to sink or swim, and then allowing huge differences in outcome, where you have the mega rich versus a huge income inequality in the United States, as well as swelling poverty and insecurity in a number of different areas. So anyway, so the Ukrainians seem to be looking at Europe and saying, I want in on Europe, I want in on NATO, I want in on the European Union, Um, the European Union has massive problems. They are looking at it with rose-colored glasses to some degree, but it's true that the European Union still, at least has, let's hope it remains, has had some of the better uh, lifestyles and outcomes for most of the people in those countries relative to almost everywhere else in the world. And so, um, and that has some of that has to do with, and this is where I'm getting into controversial territory for the left, has to do with, in fact, the defense of militarily, either from the with the help of the United States, or maybe in the future with domestic military might, in terms of domestically in those European countries, defending against or keeping a counterweight against Russian military power, and especially backed by nuclear blackmail. Okay, so anyway, so that function of NATO has not been at all celebrated by the left. It's been seen to be, in fact, it's been overlooked, or it's been, all the negative things about NATO have been emphasized. I got into a little, argument with someone who I probably disagree with on a lot of different issues, but he was pointing out that NATO had bombed, or NATO forces had bombed Belgrade during the coast of the in the 1990s, and so he was bringing this up as a way to sort of excuse Putin's bombing of Kiev and other parts of Ukraine in the last few days. So, and it is obviously Putinist propaganda to do that, even though, some of how the war against Yugoslavia, or against, I want to say, Serbia, really, in its aggression in Kosovo, some of that was conducted in the wrong way, and but nevertheless, we were also attempting to defend the Kosovars and the Albanian Kosovars against against Serbian expansionism and aggression. So anyway, so there are a number of peoples then in eastern part of Europe, as well as in western part of Europe, that require some kind of military. Either they need to develop their own security, which I think is better, but they need to develop a military counterweight to to Russia, and so that military counterweight is something that has been undervalued by the left and has been overlooked, and it's been assumed to be there. In other words, that the vision of the left has not mostly taken into account the need to defend against that, because of the two principles I was talking about earlier, that the primary move with regard to Russia and regard to China is a move toward detente, a move toward negotiation overall, negotiation as the only approach. And there is good reason to do that, in the sense that you don't want a nuclear war. Okay, so there's a balance of a number of different of those values. Like avoiding nuclear war is a very high value, is an extremely high value, but also democracy and allowing self-determination of peoples is also a fundamental right and of people around the world. So I wouldn't say it may be a prudent position or a careful position to say we should avoid nuclear war and urge negotiation, urge the Ukrainians to seek negotiation immediately, and to organize a ceasefire on their end unilaterally, and in anticipation of being able to negotiate with Russia, and so to end that war, and no matter what the territorial losses are involved with that are. So so that's I would say I wouldn't say it's a left position, no, but it's it may be a prudent position, but it is one of a number of prudent positions. So in other words, there are a number of different choices there where, and I think in this case, the better position, and I hope to be proven right, and I'm taking some risks in saying this, is that I think that Ukraine needs to continue to defend itself against against the military aggression of Russia, and that we need to shape the world in such a way that that can happen, but at the same time we creates enough security guarantees for Russia that they don't reach for the nuclear codes. And that the thing is that Putin, unfortunately, is kind of he is becoming, or is appearing to be, a megalomaniacal tyrant of a totalitarian state. And he's turned what was a garden variety autocratic state into a totalitarian one. I did another recent video, or a few months back, a video about that. And so it's hard to know where whether he can come out of that state, the megalomania. I don't want to consign him entirely to the pure evil category. He's doing pure evil right now in Ukraine, or yes, he's doing pure evil in Ukraine. I could say that, but there needs to be space allowed for him to come out of that, and not necessarily by the Ukrainians, but the U.S. among others. So to create that sense that all we want is him to get out of Ukraine, okay? And if that leads him to his regime to topple, well, that's his problem. But we're not going to guarantee his regime for him, and that's some of his concern. That's why I think he's reaching to some. But we can't. We have to. And I think the Biden administration is doing a pretty good job in this area. So I'm not saying that there's a lot wrong with how they've been interacting with Russia when the invasion was obvious. In fact, when the CIA correctly predicted the invasion of Ukraine. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that you can take the position that I'm not saying is the left position, but is a potentially prudent position. But it's also it does erase the national self-determination and self-defense needs of Ukrainians, and that's not a left. That may be, again, a prudent position for the United States, but not necessarily for Ukrainians, and also not necessarily. It might be there, depending on the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons. So the Ukrainians are willing to take that risk, it seems like, and so if we again, I take a more left position, or a more ethical position, in my opinion, is we allow them to take that risk without our creating the conditions for Russia to think that they're being attacked in reality. Now, obviously, in propaganda, Putin will claim that everyone is attacking him, but at least in reality, that we won't. In other words, that we won't be sending missiles from us to them, or that we don't finance Ukraine attacking Russian territory, and so forth and so on, and we don't arm them to enable them, or let's say we put conditions on the use of the arms. And this is something that Sam Cedar was talking about in a recent episode of a Majority Report, that he's not against conditions, though again he has I think, rather cavalierly overlooked the position of Ukrainians' willingness to fight for their own self-determination and their own liberation of their country. And so now there's all kinds of problems with that too. I mean, there are rightists who are very strong Ukrainian nationalists. There are fascists, neo-fascists, who are or paleo-fascists who are in Ukraine, no friends to the Jewish people. Okay, including, I mean, even though the prime minister is Jewish currently in Ukraine, but there are people in Ukraine who I think need to be continually monitored and watched and made sure not to install themselves into key positions or still more key positions if they're already, some of them are in key positions within the Ukrainian military and so forth and so on. They need to be watched, monitored. There needs to be an internal denazification of some of these elements of Ukraine, but not imposed on it by Russia, and that's a process that I think there is a good basis for it to start if Ukraine can win this war, win in a sense of reclaiming its national territory, and then under the leadership of Zelensky. So, but we will see. I mean, I'm not claiming with this support for Ukraine and their struggle for national self-determination that they're an ideal society, that the forces that are fighting for that are all of people of good character, or of many of them are of good character, clearly, but they're all or politically are on my side, okay, or on the side of the Enlightenment even. I mean, fascism is an anti-Enlightenment mystical mystical worship of the nation and of national culture against Enlightenment ideas and against modernity, really, and international, a humanism, against a recognition of the equality of peoples and so forth and so on, and the creation of a multi-ethnic society in Ukraine as well as in other states. So anyway, so I just wanted to create a discourse, or start elaborate a discourse where we can discuss the different components of what the left has been missing, and it's, I think, the necessary defense of democracies. Also internally, we've had to discover in the United States that we need to defend our own democracy from forces within the United States. In other words, from the fascists in the United States. And in the case of Ukraine, the fascists, the most important fascists, are now those from another country, from Russia. There could be some problems from the fascists inside Ukraine as well, in terms of maintaining and reinforcing the democracy of Ukraine. But currently in the United States, our biggest threat is internal, the internal threat to our democracy. So, but part of it is that people on the left have been caught off guard. I mean, I think now the left, or parts of the left, are the most resolute anti-fascist forces, but they're been poorly positioned. They've been wrong-footed by the fascists themselves, by the neo-fascists, by the Trumpists. And so, and as of the Democrats, who are not necessarily left, but the Democrats who, the left hasn't been a stalwart beacon of anti-fascism and understanding of the need, for instance, of rule of law, okay, and the important terrain of rule of law and of the law of struggle for political progress and for human equality, and that terrain has been ceded often to the right or to liberal, mealy-mouthed liberal principles and ideals that don't stand a chance against or haven't stood a strong chance, at least lately, against the rightist assault of, for instance, the Federalist Society and other like, and Leonard Leo, who have, the Supreme Court, the people who have engineered the U.S. Supreme Court. So anyway, so I think there's an overall principle of understanding the need to value rule of law, democracy, and the value that's brought to us so far, and that there's the protection for, in some sense, the weak or the less powerful, even as it's used sometimes against them, but it's a better protection than not having it. Okay. And so anyway, so that plays itself out also in Europe and also in our attitudes toward, or how we've been wrong-footed by what's happened in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's better said better. So anyway, so I think I'll probably be talking more, or I will be talking more about this in future episodes. But I want to bring this to a close and to be continued. And please share your thoughts about the this current video in the comments below. Also, if you're getting something out of Politics 2100, please subscribe. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks.